From New York, this is Democracy Now! The U.S. Congress certifies the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, hours after a violent right-wing white supremacist mob incited by President Trump storms the U.S. Capitol in what's been described as an attempted coup. 4 people died in a day that shook the nation.
The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes.
Lawmakers held the vote hours after being forced into hiding inside the Capitol as right-wing rioters ransacked the building.
Today, a shameful assault was made on our democracy. It cannot, however, deter us from our responsibility to validate the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Hours after the deadly insurrection began, President Trump told the rioters, quote, "We love you, you're very special." Talk is now growing of removing the president from office before his term ends January 20th. We'll spend the hour looking at these remarkable developments. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A violent mob incited by President Donald Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol Wednesday, attacking police, ransacking and looting offices, and sending lawmakers diving for cover amidst gunfire and tear gas. The unprecedented violence interrupted a joint session of Congress convened to certify Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's Electoral College victory. It came after President Trump, backed by his attorney Rudy Giuliani, rallied thousands of supporters outside the White House, urging them to march on the Capitol to overturn the results of the election.
Let's have trial by combat.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
After the speech, Trump retreated to the White House while his mob marched on Congress, where they pushed past police and smashed their way into the Capitol. The Secret Service whisked Vice President Mike Pence to safety as terrified lawmakers fled the House and Senate chambers. A dozen lawmakers were trapped on the gallery above the House floor as marauders tried to force their way past barricades. Some of the lawmakers put on emergency gas masks as tear gas filled the air. Others broke furniture apart to fashion makeshift clubs to defend themselves before Capitol Police finally cleared a path for their escape. The insurrectionists overturned desks, tore paintings off walls, posed for photos on the House and Senate daises, and looted the office of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. 4 people died in the melee, including Ashley Babbitt, an Air Force veteran and supporter of the racist pro-Trump QAnon conspiracy theory. She was fatally shot by police inside the Capitol. Washington's police chief said 3 other people died in, quote, separate medical emergencies, but provided no details. A bomb squad discovered pipe bombs left outside the headquarters of the Republican and Democratic National Committees, and police seized a rifle and Molotov cocktails from a truck parked near the Capitol. The insurrectionists were overwhelmingly white and male. Some carried Confederate flags and displayed white supremacist and neo-Nazi symbols. More than an hour after the attempted coup, President Trump released a short video statement asking his supporters to go home while adding, quote, "We love you and you're very special," unquote. Despite the extraordinary scenes of violence, police arrested just 26 people on the Capitol grounds Wednesday. Congressmember Tim Ryan, the Ohio Democrat charged with funding the Capitol Police, told Politico, quote, "I think it's pretty clear there's going to be a number of people who are going to be without employment very, very soon," he said. One video appears to show Capitol Police opening a metal barricade outside the Capitol building. As the mob surges forward, the police walk slowly backwards, making no obvious attempt to stop them. Another video shows a Capitol Police officer posing for a selfie with an insurrectionist inside the Capitol building. Meanwhile, CNN reports President Trump resisted demands he send in Washington, D.C.'s National Guard to stop the insurrection. Instead, it was Vice President Mike Pence who coordinated with the Pentagon to send in the Guard troops after hours of delay. After Congress reconvened Wednesday night following the violence, several Republican lawmakers called for ending the objections to the certification of the Electoral College vote. This is Utah Republican Senator Mitt Romney.
What happened here today was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States. Those who choose to continue to support his dangerous gambit by objecting to the results of a legitimate democratic election will forever be seen as being complicit in an unprecedented attack against our democracy.
At 3:40 a.m. this morning, Congress formally declared President-elect Joe Biden the winner of the Electoral College. The declaration capped hours of debate that saw 6 Republican senators and 121 Republican Congress members object to certifying results in the swing states of Arizona and Pennsylvania. Moments after Biden's win was made formal, the White House released a statement attributed to President Trump. It read in part, quote, "Even though I totally disagree with the outcome of the election and the facts bear me out, nevertheless, there will be an orderly transition on January 20th, he reportedly said. Multiple news outlets report members of President Trump's cabinet have discussed invoking the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump from power. Such a move would require the support of a majority of cabinet members, as well as Vice President Mike Pence. Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee wrote to Pence Wednesday demanding he take such action. Joining the call was the president of the National Association of Manufacturers, representing 14,000 corporations. Minnesota Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar said she's drafting articles of impeachment. Her bid has already drawn the support of more than 24 lawmakers. Meanwhile, newly sworn-in Democratic Congressmember Cori Bush of Missouri tweeted, quote, "My first resolution in Congress will be to call for the expulsion of the Republican members of Congress who incited this domestic terror attack on the Capitol," she said. First Lady Melania Trump's chief of staff, the former White House press secretary Stephanie Grisham, resigned just hours after Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol. Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger also quit, as did Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, who said, quote, "I was deeply disturbed by what I saw today." Other more senior Trump administration officials are reportedly considering resigning, including National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien and Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, who happens to be married to Mitch McConnell. Twitter locked President Trump's account for 12 hours Wednesday and deleted 3 of his tweets after he incited violence at the Capitol. Twitter cited Trump's, quote, "repeated and severe violations of its policies." Facebook followed suit later Wednesday, blocking Trump from posting for 24 hours on its main platform and on Instagram. BuzzFeed News reports that earlier Wednesday, Facebook managers silenced comments on an internal message board where employees discussed removing Trump from the social media site. World leaders reacted in horror over the storming of the U.S. Capitol. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on U.S. political leaders to demand their followers refrain from violence. Leaders of the U.K., New Zealand, Australia, Canada, India, Japan, France, Germany, NATO, and the European Council called for a peaceful transfer of power to Joe Biden. In a statement, Venezuela's government condemned political polarization and the spiral of violence, adding, quote, "With this unfortunate episode, the United States is experiencing what it has generated in other countries with its policies of aggression," unquote. The Democratic Party's poised to take control of the U.S. Senate after Georgia Democrat Jon Ossoff was projected the winner of Tuesday's runoff election against Republican incumbent Senator David Perdue. At 33 years old, Jon Ossoff is the youngest person elected to the Senate since Joe Biden won in 1972. Senator-elect Ossoff live-streamed a victory speech Wednesday promising he'd fight to end the pandemic.
I will work in the U.S. Senate to support a robust public health response so that we can defeat this virus, putting Georgia's own Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the lead, trusting medical expertise, doctors and scientists to bring the tools to bear, the technology to bear, the ingenuity to bear, and the resources to bear necessary to stop the spread of this virus, to defeat it and to get our daily lives back, and to rush direct economic relief to people who need help right now.
Ossoff's victory came after another Georgia Democrat, Reverend Raphael Warnock, was projected the winner over Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler. Before his Twitter account was temporarily suspended Wednesday, President Trump tweeted baseless conspiracy theories that the Georgia Senate election was rigged. The United States set another daily coronavirus world record Wednesday with nearly 4,000 deaths from COVID-19. U.S. hospitalizations hit a new record high, topping 132,000. More than 250,000 new infections were confirmed Wednesday alone. California's total cases have topped 2.5 million, with hospitals reporting critical shortages of oxygen, ICU beds, and medical workers to tend to 23,000 patients. In New York, 3 more incarcerated people died of COVID-19 Wednesday, adding to a record surge in prisoner deaths. In other news from New York, the largest health system in the state, Northwell, announced Tuesday it would rescind some 2,500 medical debt lawsuits it filed during the pandemic and would stop suing patients after the New York Times reported on the lawsuits. They were reporting on an expose done by the Community Service Society. Joe Biden has nominated Judge Merrick Garland for Attorney General. Garland is a centrist judge who's already received the support of prominent Republicans. He was President Obama's pick to serve on the Supreme Court after the death of Antonin Scalia in 2016, but his nomination stalled after Republican senators led by Mitch McConnell refused to put it up for a vote. Garland has served on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for over 2 decades and previously worked at the Justice Department, where he prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombing case. Many progressives expressed disappointment at the pick, which was seen as a safe choice for bipartisan confirmation on the same day Democrats gained control of the Senate and following the historic uprising for Black lives over the summer. As a judge, Merrick Garland's record shows him often siding with law enforcement. Biden has also tapped Lisa Monaco, Obama's advisor for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, as Deputy Attorney General, Vanita Gupta as Associate Attorney General, and Kristen Clarke, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. To see our last interview with Kristen Clarke just this week, go to DemocracyNow.org. In Kentucky, the Louisville Police Department has officially fired 2 detectives involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor after the 2 men received pre-termination letters last week. Taylor is the 26-year-old Black emergency room technician who was shot to death in her own home on March 13th by police, sparking mass protests. The officers are Detective Miles Cosgrove, who fired the shot that killed Taylor, and Detective Joshua Janes, who prepared the search warrant that led to the fatal raid. No one has been criminally charged over Breonna Taylor's death. Newly elected Illinois Congressmember Mary Miller has received widespread condemnation for praising Hitler. Miller made the comment at a Moms for America rally in D.C. on Tuesday.
Hitler was right on one thing. He said, whoever has a youth has the future.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, who's Jewish, called Miller's remarks unfathomable and disgusting during a news conference Wednesday.
Hitler got nothing right. This reprehensible rhetoric has no place in our politics.
Washington, D.C.'s police chief has warned Republican freshman Congressmember Lauren Boebert against violating the district's strict gun control laws after she posted a video to social media vowing she would bring her Glock pistol to Congress.
Even though I now work in one of the most liberal cities in America, I refuse to give up my rights, especially my Second Amendment rights.
Under federal law, Congress members are allowed to have guns on Capitol grounds if they're unloaded and securely wrapped. They're barred from carrying a gun on the House floor. Congressmember Boebert owns a restaurant known as Shooter's Grill in the town of Rifle, Colorado, where servers openly carry firearms. She's expressed support for the racist pro-Trump QAnon conspiracy theory. And basketball superstar LeBron James suggested he'll try to buy the WNBA team Atlanta Dream from freshly defeated Senator Kelly Loeffler Wednesday. LeBron James tweeted, "Think I'm going to put together an ownership group for the Dream. Who's in?" He added a photo of the team's players wearing Vote Warnock T-shirts. Atlanta Dream's players endorsed Senator-elect Raphael Warnock in his race against their team's co-owner Kelly Loeffler, who has spoken out against the Black Lives Matter movement. Journalist Jamel Hill credited the WNBA players for helping propel Reverend Warnock to victory. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. When we come back, when a violent mob incited by President Donald Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol Wednesday, some carried Confederate flags like the one torn down by Bree Newsom Bass in South Carolina. She'll join us to respond to yesterday's remarkable events in Washington, D.C. We'll also speak to Manisha Sinha, a historian of slavery, abolition, Civil War, and Reconstruction. And finally, journalist Alan Nairn. Stay with us.
Lord, I wonder what's got the matter. I'm trying over time. It seems like the hours, everything done changed, but I hold in my hand. Lord, I'm trying to make you understand. Lord, you know what? Everybody, they tell me somebody done hoodoo the hoodoo man. Now you know I buzzed your bell this morning, baby, had your elevator running slow. I buzzed your bell, little girl, take me up on a third floor, but I hold in my hand. Lord, I'm trying to make you understand. Lord, you know what? They tells the baby that somebody done hoodoo the hoodoo man. Look at here, baby.
Hoodoo Man Blues by Junior Wells Chicago Blues Band. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, and so is Nermeen Sheikh, co-host, joining us from a remote location. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, the U.S. Congress certified the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris shortly before 4 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, about 14 hours after a violent mob incited by President Trump stormed and occupied the U.S. Capitol in an act of insurrection to stop the counting of votes. Some lawmakers describe the siege as an attempted coup. Members of the right-wing mob smashed windows, broke down doors, and scaled walls to enter the Capitol. They attacked Capitol Police. They ransacked and looted offices, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's. An armed standoff took place at the door of the U.S. House of Representatives. Rioters took over the Senate chamber with some Trump supporters, including a prominent supporter of the QAnon conspiracy theory, posing for photos in the seat occupied by Vice President Mike Pence just minutes before. One man carried a large Confederate flag inside the Capitol. Another wore a shirt that read, quote, "Camp Auschwitz." Vice President Pence and many lawmakers were evacuated to secure locations just as the mob breached the Capitol. Other lawmakers hid in their offices. 4 people died, including a Trump supporter who was shot dead by police. Meanwhile, explosive devices were found at the headquarters of the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee. As of last night, Washington police had made just 26 arrests on Capitol grounds. Lawmakers are calling for probes into the Capitol Hill police after officers were seen moving barricades for Trump supporters and taking selfies with members of the right-wing mob. The insurrection began shortly after Trump spoke at a rally, urging supporters to head to the Capitol after once again falsely claiming the election had been stolen.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
When Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, the president remained silent, safely in the White House. The New York Times reports he initially rebuffed and resisted requests to mobilize the National Guard to protect the Capitol. Hours after the insurrection began, Trump released a video statement urging his supporters to go home while telling them, "We love you. You're very special." Calls are mounting for Trump to be removed from office before his term ends January 20th. Multiple news outlets report some members of his cabinet have discussed invoking the 25th Amendment to remove him from power. Such a move would require the support of a majority of cabinet members, as well as Vice President Mike Pence. The move has been backed by Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee, as well as the National Association of Manufacturers, which says it's needed to, quote, preserve democracy. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar says she's drawing up new articles of impeachment. New Jersey Senator Cory Booker condemned the president for inciting the violence.
I can only think of 2 times in American history that individuals laid siege to our Capitol, stormed our sacred civic spaces, and tried to upend and overrun this government. One was in the War of 1812, and the other one was today. What's interesting about the parallel between the two is they both were waving flags to a sole sovereign, to an individual, surrendering democratic principles to the cult of personality. One was a monarch in England, and the other were the flags I saw all over our Capitol, including in the hallways and in this room, to a single person named Donald Trump. The sad difference between these 2 times is one was yet another nation in the history of our country that tried to challenge the United States of America. But this time, we brought this hell upon ourselves.
President Trump's former chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, announced this morning he would resign from his post as special envoy to Northern Ireland following Wednesday's insurrection. Shortly after the election, Mulvaney wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal titled, "If he loses, Trump will concede gracefully." At least 4 other Trump administration officials resigned on Wednesday. Shortly after Congress certified Biden's victory, Trump issued a statement saying there would be an orderly transition of power on January 20th, but then repeated false claims that he had won the election. He keeps repeating by a landslide. He ended the message saying, quote, "It's only the beginning of our fight to make America great again." The certification vote process was prolonged after Republican lawmakers challenged the election results in Arizona and Pennsylvania in a last-bid effort to overturn the election. The senators were led by Senator Hawley. The Kansas City Star said he has blood on his hands for continuing with challenging the vote after the mass insurrection. We begin today's show with 2 guests. Manisha Sinha is professor of American history at University of Connecticut. She's author of The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. And we go to North Carolina, where we're joined by Bree Newsome-Bast, artist and anti-racist activist. Following the massacre of 8 African-American parishioners and their pastor by a white supremacist at the Emanuel AME Church in Charleston in June 2015, Bree scaled the 30-foot flagpole at the South Carolina State Capitol and removed the Confederate flag. There were Confederate flags in the Capitol yesterday, carried by the insurrectionists. She's now a housing activist in North Carolina. Bree, let's begin with you. You were tweeting up a storm as the storm was unfolding in Washington, D.C. yesterday. You said, y'all, the D.C. mayor requested the National Guard. The Pentagon was discussing the threat long before today. It's not possible security forces were caught off guard, unprepared, or simply failed. Please cease this ridiculous narrative. So take it from there, Bree.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to join you. I mean, I was on social media, all yesterday, and like everyone else was just kind of gripped by watching the events that were happening. And one of the things that we saw throughout the day yesterday were people like myself who have been present for various protests or, and mostly people of color, Black people, noting the obvious difference in terms of how police, have a coordinated, overtly militarized response to any kind of protest that is challenging racism in policing or racism in the government versus what we witnessed yesterday. And I think that what we saw yesterday is just another one of these kind of flashpoint moments in history that just represents a culmination of everything that came before it, and really shines a spotlight on everything that is fundamentally wrong. And one of those things is clearly policing. The idea that we had no idea that this was coming, which, I think is frankly one of the ongoing, most disturbing talking points that we have gotten throughout the Trump administration. People saying, how could we have gotten here? This isn't who we are, which just completely flies, not just in the face of American history, right? But in the face of the events of just the past 5 years. I mean, everything that we have seen in the past 5 years pointed to what happened yesterday happening. And so the idea that security officials, people who are tasked with protecting the Capitol, could not have foreseen the conflict that played out yesterday is clearly beyond belief. I mean, there's no way to believe that that is the case.
And Bree, quite apart from the fact that, it was just an astounding spectacle of all these, effectively domestic terrorists invading the Capitol, what's also strange, if not outright stunning, is the fact that there was such little comment from either the Department of Justice or security agencies responding to this extraordinary event. Apart, of course, from the FBI asking for explicit help in identifying those who instigated the violence, an extremely bizarre request, given that it was quite apparent who the instigators were.
Absolutely. I mean, again, the central issue here is white supremacy. And white supremacy was foundational to the establishment of this nation. That is the central conflict. I mean, that is the main thing that I continue to say, as an activist, is that clearly this is the essential conflict. It is baked into our institutions. It was baked into our Constitution at the founding. And that continues to be the case. And that explains why I wouldn't even describe it as a difficulty in figuring out, what is going on. It's just the fact that it is the defining internal conflict of the nation. So yes, of course, you have people within the military, you have people within policing, you have people within the government. It was elected officials who initiated the events that led to this riot. One of the things that was most striking to me yesterday, I was, among the people who kind of stayed up into the wee hours of the morning watching how things played out at the Capitol, was, you would see congressperson after congressperson condemning the insurrectionist mob. So you're talking about, the civilians who showed up, but there was still very little acknowledgement of the fact that the people who led the insurrection, the people who have incited these people to mob the Capitol, were sitting there in the chamber. Were still voicing their objection to the election. So, this idea that we are somehow just going to, reach across the aisle and shake hands and carry on as though we did not witness things play out as it did, as though the primary inciter of violence yesterday was not the president of the United States, is just completely unrealistic. And there's no way that can happen.
And Bree, you also, among your tweets yesterday, you wrote that what was happening yesterday was not the culmination of the last 4 years, but in fact, the culmination of the last 5 centuries. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that was actually me retweeting someone else who made that excellent point. And again, it goes to the heart of this false notion that we could not foresee what was happening, or that this is not America. This is absolutely America. We have an ongoing, prolonged history, not just of, colonization and slavery and genocide in this country, but also this constant back and forth where we try to make strides towards having a democracy that truly recognizes, the rights and citizenship of all people, and violent white supremacist backlash against that cause. I mean, people were bringing up the Wilmington riots, right, of 1898, which took place here in North Carolina. Another example in the aftermath of the Civil War, where you had Black people being elected to Congress, working in collaboration with, white elected officials, and they were overthrown. There was a white mob that just, came to town, burned down buildings, and violently overthrew the democratically elected government. And we are still in our state in the year 2021 dealing with the aftermath of that conflict. So this is not something that is foreign to the United States. This is something that is very much baked into our DNA. What happened yesterday cannot be separated, of course, from the fact that we just had an election that not only ousted a blatant white nationalist president, but we just elected a Catholic president, a vice president who is Black and Indian American. And then we had the Senate just flip day before yesterday with the election of a Black man and a Jewish man from Georgia. So yes, of course we're going to see white supremacists in the Capitol waving Confederate flags. Of course, we have known for years now that the greatest imminent threat to the United States is both white supremacists, far-right terrorists, and the current president of the United States. So again, for anyone in a position of security or authority who is tasked with securing national security and securing the Capitol and the safety of the people who work and reside there, to claim that this was somehow unpredictable, again, flies in the face of any logic. And if we are going to be serious about addressing the threats that we face right now from fascism and from the far right, we have to confront the presence of that element in our police forces. Point blank, period. This has been the main point that we have been making in the Black Lives Matter movement and the calls for defunding the police and shifting resources, because it is very clear that the primary function of police forces in the United States is to enforce racism above enforcing public safety.
As you point out, I mean, yesterday was bookended. the early morning hours of Wednesday, it was announced that the first African-American Democrat was elected senator from the South, and that was Raphael Warnock. Then yesterday afternoon, the Democrat John Ossoff, it was announced, had beaten David Perdue, and that shifted the power of the U.S. Senate. This bookends this insurrection at the Capitol. And also, just 2 days ago, in Wisconsin, the DA chose not to bring charges against the white police officer who shot Jacob Blake in the back, the African-American 29-year-old, 7 times at point-blank range. But going from the immediate history and this week, the white supremacist Proud Boys leader being arrested in D.C. with long guns with automatic weapons, very clear what was going to be happening in Washington, to centuries analysis. Let's turn to Manisha Sinha, in addition to Bree Newsom-Bass, who is still with us. Professor Sinha is historian of slavery, abolition, Civil War, and Reconstruction, and the author of The Slave's Cause and the Counter-Revolution of Slavery, professor at University of Connecticut. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor. So if you can respond to what happened yesterday and then explain this discussion right now of the 25th Amendment and what this would mean.
Thank you for having me, Amy. Well, I think what happened yesterday was rather astounding. As a historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction, I have often made comparisons between what has happened under the Trump regime, and I call it a regime, not an administration, and what has happened earlier in our history. But I did not think that this would actually come to pass, though I should have suspected it, considering what had happened in Michigan just recently. Now, as Bree mentioned, this attempt to disrupt the democratic process, in this case, the counting of the votes of the Electoral College, by the use of domestic terror, has happened repeatedly in our history, and it especially happened during Reconstruction. Not just the Wilmington coup of 1898, but before that, in each of the southern states, either voting or actually democratic governance was disrupted by right-wing white terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, the White League, the Red Shirts of Wade Hampton in South Carolina. There were a number of them. And so these groups today remind me of those people. And they were the ones flying the Confederate flag in Congress. That did not happen during the Civil War. And it happened yesterday. So I think this is an awful portent for our democracy, and we need to respond forcefully to it. Either enforce the enforcement acts from the Reconstruction era to arrest and prosecute all. I am shocked at the few who have been arrested so far. Now, clearly, we need to evoke the 25th Amendment against Donald Trump. I don't think we have the time to go through a lengthy impeachment process anymore. But we do have the time to invoke the 25th Amendment. The question is, will Mike Pence and his cabinet and a section of the Republican Party go on with this? They have clearly enabled Trump so far. Even those who denounced violence yesterday were clearly complicit in the extent to which Trump has challenged the election results. And there is still a segment within the Republican Party, 102 members of the House of Representatives and 7 senators, because Rick Scott joined the challenge for the Electoral College votes of Pennsylvania. So we are seeing right now a substantial group within the Republican Party, too, that is enabling Trump. And this is extremely dangerous. A message needs to be sent. Trump needs to be disabled, and these members of Congress, as Cori Bush has called, need to be censured, expelled. They need to bear the consequences of their actions in inciting violence.
Now, Professor Sinha, you've also suggested that the reason Trump called on these effectively domestic terrorists was because it became clear that the U.S. military was not going to support him in his attempts to subvert the election, effectively to instigate a coup. So could you talk about that, the resistance of the military to participate, and what it means, if it's significant? And also, you were talking about a reconstruction. Could you talk about the significance of discussing a reconstruction now?
Yes, so I think that it was quite clear in the last few days by the statement made by former secretaries of defense, by statements made by senior military officials, that they would not enable a coup. And for all those who poo-pooed the idea that Trump would go that far, that likened him more as an authoritarian working within the structures of our government, I would say that they have not actually comprehended the extent of the madness of this man. It was clear when he tear-gassed protesters and used the army to do that he would go that far. When he actually applauded people who were gunning down protesters on the streets of the United States, that he would go that far. And I think it is really important to remember that finally there were people in the military and others who realized that we are in a democracy. The military is under civilian law, but they cannot obey unconstitutional orders. He has pardoned people who have violated the military's code of conduct, people who have committed war crimes. Trump is a full-blown fascist as far as I'm concerned, and if he could have used the military to orchestrate a coup, he would have done it. Mark my words, there's no doubt in my mind that he would have done it. So I'm thankful that, even after taking such a battering, some of our institutions have held up, including this principle of the military subservience to constitutional law. And that is why he called on the Proud Boys and these right-wing terrorists across the country. That's exactly what happened during Reconstruction, when these white terror groups, predominantly white men, would, in fact, with impunity, murder people, storm legislatures, kill leading politicians. There was a plot, remember, to kidnap Governor Whitner. So they are replaying the playbook of the Reconstruction terror groups. And we should replay the playbook of the federal government and the Union Army to actually take action against these people. A lot is at stake. Our constitutional democracy is at stake. I'm not one for constantly evoking state power, but in this case, that is the only solution. And I'm still shocked that law enforcement was found so wanting. We know that the mayor of D.C. had requested National Guard help the day before yesterday, and her request was still under review at the Department of Defense, which is now, of course, staffed by Trump loyalists. So we are in a very dangerous situation.
And in the end, it wasn't President Trump, according to the New York Times, but Vice President Pence who called in the National Guard, who had been evacuated before almost anyone else. The Congress members left to fend for themselves, some hunkering down in the galley. They were there to socially distance above. Many had put on gas masks. If you can talk about the cabinet members who are threatening to resign. You've got Elaine Chao, transportation, apparently Robert O'Neill. These are just reports of this. They haven't. And what role they would play in the 25th Amendment, as well as Pence, because he would become president in this period.
Yes, he would. And I think it is high time for them to take action. The problem is that so many people have left Trump's cabinet. And besides Elaine Chao and the Secretary for Transportation, we haven't heard a peep from the other members of the cabinet who presumably are Trump loyalists. The fact that the National Guard was eventually called out only because of Pence is shameful. That already shows that Trump has abdicated his duties. President-elect Joe Biden has clearly said This man is not capable of even governing, and in fact, he is inciting sedition. He said that he loves these people.
So what would it look like? What does it mean to invoke the 25th Amendment?
So it's never happened in the history of the United States. It's been contemplated, but it has actually never happened. But we are in uncharted waters after what happened yesterday. A majority of the cabinet and Vice President Pence would have to agree on invoking the 25th Amendment. And then that action would have to be agreed by a majority in Congress. And I think that should be done. That ought to be done. Let us see if Mike Pence, who has, in fact, in this, after being such a loyalist in all the egregious actions taken by the Trump administration, at least in this particular case, has said that he will not violate his constitutional role of merely announcing the votes for the Electoral College. Let us see if he has the backbone to actually invoke the 25th Amendment with a majority of the cabinet members. It ought to be done. It's the only solution we have now to rein in Trump. Remember, he is still president, and he could start a war. He could do anything. And at this point, he is so desperate and he is so criminal in his actions that I wouldn't put it past him to do anything. I think he's a national security threat to this country. He's certainly been a threat to American democracy right from the start. The 25th Amendment ought to be revoked.
Manisha Sinha, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Professor of History at UConn, University of Connecticut, author of The Slave's Cause and the Counter-Revolution of Slavery. And thanks so much to Bree Newsom Bass, artist, anti-racist activist, took down the Confederate flag that was flying over the grounds of the South Carolina Capitol. This is Democracy Now! When we return, journalist Alan Nairn on what this looks like, world reaction overseas, and what President Trump's actions yesterday mean for the world. Stay with us. Bound to Lose, version by Resistance Revival Chorus and Rhiannon Giddens. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. World leaders reacted in horror over the storming of the U.S. Capitol. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on U.S. political leaders to demand their followers refrain from violence. Leaders of the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, India, Japan, France, Germany, NATO, and the European Council called for a peaceful transfer of power to Joe Biden. In a statement, Venezuela's government condemned political polarization and the spiral of violence, adding, quote, with this unfortunate episode, the United States is experiencing what it has generated in other countries with its policies of aggression. For more, we're joined by award-winning journalist Alan Nairn, activist, investigative journalist. Alan, as we watched what happened unfold yesterday in the U.S. Congress and the difference between what happened with this mob of white supremacists, of what many are calling domestic terrorists, the difference in how the Capitol Police, some of them taking selfies with them, dealt with them versus what we saw in Lafayette Park, what happens with Black Lives Matter activists or just African Americans in general. Your response?
Well, Trump, I think, lost his chance to actually seize full power on election night when he failed to stop the vote count. But yesterday he proved that he does have a street mob and that many in law enforcement are ready to stand back and let them rampage. I think in part because many in law enforcement see themselves as being on the same team. The Capitol was under siege from the outside, from the crowd, but at the same time, it was also under siege intellectually from the inside. You had about a third of the Congress that was toying with the idea of abolishing presidential elections. And Biden said, this isn't who we are. But in fact, this is consistent with a lot of deep traditions of the U.S. rulers, restricting the franchise, which the founders always sought to do, and which the U.S. right today sees as their only hope for political survival. And also the basic bipartisan U.S. Principle of the current establishment that no election is sacrosanct. Any election can be overturned as long as it's a foreign election. The U.S. has supported coups consistently, nonstop, through every administration. Obama and John Kerry, after the Egyptian army staged a coup and overthrew the elected president, Kerry said they were acting to restore democracy. Trump, when he was president, along with General Kelly, his chief of staff, supported the stealing of an election in Honduras, where the candidate Nasrallah was winning the vote count, and where just shortly before the U.S. had supported a coup to overthrow the elected president of Honduras, Zelaya. That was under Obama. More recently, Trump supported a coup in Bolivia to overthrow the president, Evo Morales. And after that, Elon Musk, the second richest man in the world, worth $184 billion, he tweeted this just on July 24th. He said, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." And I think that's a pretty good statement of U.S. foreign policy. But now Trump, in a sense, is bringing that foreign policy home.
And Alan, could you talk about the response from, the widespread condemnation of what happened from leaders around the world? And in particular, one comment that stands out is the German foreign minister, Heiko Maas, on Twitter writing, "From inflammatory words come violent actions on the steps of the Reichstag and now in the Capitol," in reference to the 1933 Reichstag fire that the Nazi Party used as a pretext to seize power.
Well, it's always been the case that the U.S. Establishment was willing to use terror and kill civilians overseas, either to do things like seize oil, seize political power, or basically on whim. The presidency of George W. Bush was a prime example of that. But Trump brought a unique aspect. He has this unique ability to unleash the beast in white America, to reach into people's souls and bring out the worst aspects. And he also has the ability to create a fascistic atmosphere. He's a product of the American elite. He's an oligarch himself. But he takes a different approach from the respectable presidents who have been the soft, friendly face of ruthless American power. And in a way, I think he is kind of exposing the American system for what it is in many respects through his behavior and through the way he talks. But the movement that he has incited is a unique threat, and it has to be stopped. But at the same time, I think it would be a huge mistake for people who are anti-fascist to respond to that by embracing the establishment, embracing authoritarian measures. Imagine how the laws are going to be rewritten now. Imagine how security procedures are going to be rewritten now. It's almost a guarantee that it's going to be much harder now to hold demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and in the vicinity of the Capitol. It's going to be harder for movements legally, for movements like the Black Lives Movement, for example, to go out on the streets again. There's sure to be more restrictions, and there's sure to be more restrictions on speech through the newly empowered corporate censors like Facebook and Twitter and so on, and perhaps through the government itself. I think we have to be clear-eyed and don't let this Trumpist movement co-opt the idea of rebellion. Rebellion against injustice is a good thing. The problem is that the U.S. system is indeed unjust and murderous, but they are rebelling against the aspects of the U.S. system that happen to be good: the democracy, the tolerance, the chance for democratic space and organizing. That's what they're rebelling against on behalf of evils like racism, like madness, like blind obedience to the leader, Trump. But we have to be careful and stand against both that, but also the establishment, which is still the main power in the United States, and that is now in the middle of gutting the American poor, the American working class. That has to be rebelled against, just as we resist these fascistic forces. And it's not easy to do both at the same time, but it's necessary.
Alan, I mean, barring the successful invocation of the 25th Amendment, Trump is still in power for the next almost 2 weeks. Could you talk about some of the concerns you have about what might happen, what he might do in these 13 days?
Well, one deep tradition of the American establishment, and especially the corporate press, is to rally around the flag whenever an American president launches a new war. So if Trump wanted to, and if he could get the military to go along, he could do something like bomb Iran, for example. And he, in fact, recently sent a U.S. warship toward Iran just to be prepared for that possibility if his whim pulls him in that direction. He had previously been calling for his law enforcement authorities to do things like arresting Biden, arresting Hillary Clinton. He wasn't able to pull that off, but clearly, there's still a lot. There's still a lot he could do. But even after Trump is gone, Elon Musk will still be there. He'll still have his money. The American oligarchs will still be there. The U.S. security establishment will still be there, ready to do to capitals around the world what Trump's mob just did to the U.S. Capitol. Although I have to say, what has shaken the U.S. population so badly, this assault on the Capitol yesterday, is really nothing by comparison to what the U.S. operations have done in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, to other democratic movements and elected governments over the years. Just days before this, remember, the U.S. Congress, by an overwhelming margin, passed the Defense Authorization Bill to pump more money toward the Pentagon and overseas special operations, and through other measures is backing those operations of the CIA, basically dedicated to, whenever the order comes down, being ready to go in and overthrow democracy. So Americans are now getting a mild taste of their own medicine, in a sense.
We have 5
seconds. And we have to
seconds.
recognize that and fight against it. Stop it.
Alan Aaron, activist and award-winning journalist, thanks so much for joining us. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Nurmeen Sheikh. And remember, wearing a mask is an act of love.